Hello, everyone. This is Ashley Clark, Christine Taliga, Jonathan Foster, and Cole Dufour, and we are here to present on grassland monitoring for Camp Guernsey, Wyoming, as part of our final group discussion. Next slide.
So Camp Guernsey is Wyoming National Guard's primary training facility for military readiness. It encompasses roughly 80,000 acres within the High Plains Level 3 ecoregion of southeastern Wyoming. Grasslands comprise almost half of all the total training complex. Included in that is 28,000 acres of northwestern Great Plains mixed grass prairie, 10,000 acres of western Great Plains sand prairie, and around 1,800 acres of historical hay and agricultural production areas, which are characterized by high amounts of non-native species.
So taking a closer look at the Northwestern Great Plains Mixed Grass Prairie Plant Association, they're primarily the major constituents are Pascopyrum smithii, Bouteloua gracilis, and Carex filifolia. That's western wheatgrass, blue grama, and threadleaf sedge. And next slide. Also, the western Great Plains sand prairie is comprised of Hesperostipa comata and Calamaphila longifolia, which is needle and thread grass and prairie sandreed. These plant associations are associated with coarser textured substrates. Next slide.
And for this project, we developed a 6-step approach to monitoring plan development. And the first step we did was define management goals and monitoring objectives for this area. Then we plan to stratify the project area into different monitoring units, where we will select an assessment system, assess the current status of the areas, and identify any threats or drivers in that area. Excuse me. We'll also select different monitoring indicators and determine the scope of sampling. And after that, we'll select monitoring locations, where we'll establish monitoring plots and record baseline data and long-term monitoring data. Next slide.
So as step one, defining our management goals and objectives, the goal was to manage grassland ecosystems at Camp Guernsey in a manner that provides a realistic, diverse, and sustainable military training environment while maintaining native grassland communities and promoting ecosystem resilience and resistance to disturbance. We broke our monitoring objectives into 4 pieces: to detect landscape level changes in grassland vegetation community compositions, to detect landscape level change in total vegetative ground cover within grassland communities, to detect landscape level changes in soil properties affecting native grassland communities, and to detect plot landscape level changes in prevalence of non-native and invasive species within grassland communities. In all 4 objectives, we wanted within a maximum of 10% error and a 95% confidence interval. Next slide.
So next, we wanted to stratify our project area into management units and monitoring units. Camp Guernsey is divided into a north training area and a south training area, which is divided by US Highway 26 and the North Platte River. So the north training area and the south training area are further subdivided into maneuvered training areas, MTAs. And this is for training management purposes. These MTAs also roughly coincide with existing grazing allotments. So we decided to use the MTA boundaries as our management units for a rotational monitoring and management execution team. And for each monitoring or each management unit, we stratified our grasslands into monitoring units And so basically we use the grassland vegetation classification to determine our stratified sampling or our stratifications for our sampling. And so basically we have three stratifications within the project area. We have the northwestern Great Plains mixed grass prairie, the western Great Plains sand prairie, as well as the historical ag production areas, which are characterized by high amounts of introduced non-native species. And this stratification all plays into our stratified simple random sample. As you see here, MTAW was chosen for the initial management. It was chosen as the initial management unit for this monitoring protocol. And here on the right, you can see this management unit broken down and stratified based upon the vegetation community. And like I mentioned previously, we can see here we have the farmland pasture, the historical ag use areas. We also have the northwestern Great Plains mixed grass prairie and the western Great Plains sand prairie. On the left, you can see our soil maps based on soil textures. And these kind of roughly coincide with the different ecosystem types, not in all areas, but this data is also going to be used in the characterization of our macro plots for sampling.
So next, in order to, we've selected our assessment system in order to accurately assess the disturbance effects on farmland, military impacted land, and grazing land. In the upper left corner, you see an aerial photograph of a farming site at this installation. The lower left-hand corner is an example of military tracks impacts. And then the lower right-hand side, you can see the difference in the aerial photograph based on grazing regimes. So in order to provide current status on these disturbance impacts, we're looking at soil site stability parameters, hydrologic function, and biotic integrity. And in order to assess these various parameters, we will utilize the line point intercept method for our vegetation analysis. We'll utilize soil quality assessment parameters by taking soil samples and assessing for disturbance factors such as soil compaction. And then we'll also utilize the interpreting indicators of rangeland health assessment methodology to review and assess and notate areas of soil erosion, concentrated water flow, hydrologic function such as gully formation, and biotic integrity such as dead or dying plants. Next slide.
So also included in this step is the assessment of the threats and drivers of disturbance for these grasslands. Military installations offer kind of a unique case study in disturbance because some areas can be highly disturbed. Other areas might seem pristine. Usually these installations are highly dynamic environments. They can have multiple different disturbances all kind of coinciding with one another. The major disturbances that we've identified for Camp Guernsey is military training, forage utilization, historical agricultural conversion, and invasive species. The military training aspects of the disturbance can be quite unique, and it has far-reaching ranges in intensity, duration, other characteristics of disturbance. The biggest threat from military training to the grasslands is going to be by way of off-road vehicle maneuvers. You can see down here we have a picture of what we call the HIMARS rocket launcher. It's a high mobility artillery rocket system, and this is one of the main military vehicles utilized by the Wyoming National Guard. We can also see one of the major disturbance regimes is also cattle grazing, and we see a large patch of invasive cheatgrass as well.
So for our monitoring indicators, and we set up a monitoring protocol that includes our macro plots, which are 200 by 100 meters in dimensions. And in the eastern half of the macro plot will be our transects, and our transects will be randomly selected in each macro plot. In the western half of our macro plot, we'll conduct the soil sampling and the rangeland health assessment. The line point intercept data that we'll take will include 3 canopy layers, the top canopy, the lower canopy, and then ground level. It'll notate whether the ground is bare or if litter is on the ground or if rock fragments are noted. The soil sampling will include bulk density, which will provide us an indication of the compaction rate of the area, soil respiration, which will give us an indication of the soil microbial activity, texture class identification, pH, electrical conductivity, and macro and micronutrients. Next slide.
Excuse me. For the management and restoration implications, we plan on utilizing reference sites for each of the different types to determine our restoration goals. The goal of the restoration for each site is for each site to become a self-sustaining system. And the goal we are hoping to accomplish within 20 to 25 year time frame. And we'll be monitoring this data yearly and doing analysis on it every 3 to 5 years. Ideally, our hope would be to match the sites 100% to the reference sites, but however, since this is highly unlikely, a 70 to 80% match to the reference sites would be acceptable. Next slide.
So within this monitoring regime, defining restoration is very important, and you can define it in multiple ways and measure it in multiple ways. One of which is that similarity to the reference sites, assuming the reference sites are considered restored or natural. If it's a properly functioning ecosystem on its own, if the ecosystem is able to maintain native species populations, if the system is resilient to disturbances, and lastly, you could also say restoring a disturbed site back to a properly functioning, sustaining system. And all of these definitions are going to be used in our measurements. Next slide.
So a little bit about adaptive management. This is basically a management plan that offers flexibility in response to monitoring results. And it's usually compared to a toolbox. There's different tools for different jobs, but all the tools really work together to get the same job done. If a current tool is not accomplishing the goal, then you reach into the toolbox and use another tool, another management approach, or another management action. Like I mentioned, this allows for flexibility in decision making. Decisions can be modified. And there's also a learning curve that allows for learning while we make decisions.
different management tools that we can use and are at our disposal is changing the season of use. And this may entail just delaying turn on until the soil is dry, or it may change from summer to winter grazing. We can also reduce the level of utilization, where say utilization's at 50%, we can reduce it by 10% or so. We can also reduce the stocking numbers, where you just reduce the number of head that are turned on. We also plan on have at our option a deferred rest rotation, where the different pastures would be rested for each year or different years. We also have the removal of livestock at our option, even though this would be the last result, along with the removal of military activity. We also plan to develop and implement an invasive species treatment plan and an early detection rapid response plan for invasive species. Next slide.
So overall, this monitoring plan was really designed to be as dynamic as the grasslands within this training complex. Adaptive management is a really good tool because, like I said, you don't have to get stuck in a management plan that might not be. Let the monitoring, you let the data really dictate those management decisions. Anybody got any questions?